bought the cheapest farm in the valley, but it already belonged to three giant women. Farming was not just a career to him, it was a lifestyle, a chance to work with the land, to grow food, and to build a life of independence. But reality had always been different. City life demanded jobs that were stressful and apartments that felt cramped. Every time he tried to save money for his dream, unexpected expenses seemed to appear. Yet John never gave up. He spent months searching online, reading old newspapers, and even talking to real estate agents in neighboring towns. He wanted a farm that was affordable, small enough for him to manage alone, yet fertile enough to grow crops and raise animals. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months, but nothing seemed right. Some farms were too expensive, others were too far from town, some were in such poor condition that they would require years of repair. He began to lose hope. One rainy afternoon, while sipping coffee at his small kitchen table, John saw an online listing that made him sit up straight. The title read, "Cheapest Farm in the Valley Must Sell Quickly." The photograph showed a wide field with patches of green, a small farmhouse with peeling paint, and a few scattered trees. It was not perfect, but for the price, it seemed like a miracle. Heart racing, John clicked on the details. The farm was exactly the size he wanted, with a modest house, a barn, and plenty of land for planting. The price was astonishingly low, far lower than anything else he had seen. Without thinking twice, John called the real estate agent. He asked questions, arranged a visit, and in less than a week, he signed the papers. The feeling of finally owning something of his own was overwhelming. He packed his belongings, said goodbye to his apartment, and set off to the valley where his new life awaited. The drive to the farm was long, winding through narrow roads and past dense forests. As he approached, he saw the valley spread out before him. Mist hovered over the distant hills, and the sunlight broke through in golden streams, making the fields shimmer. For a moment, John felt like he had stepped into a painting. He could almost imagine the crops growing, the animals grazing, and himself walking freely without a care in the world. When John finally reached the farm, he parked his car near the farmhouse and stepped out. The air smelled of fresh grass and earth, a sharp contrast to the exhaust and concrete he had left behind. At first, everything seemed calm and empty. The house was old but still standing solidly. The barn leaned slightly, but the roof was intact. Fields stretched in every direction, dotted with wildflowers and patches of soil ready for planting. It felt perfect, or so he thought. As he walked toward the front door, John noticed something strange. He heard voices. At first he thought it was the wind or birds in the distance. But then the voices became clearer, deep and resonant, unlike anything he had ever heard. They were speaking in a language he didn't recognize, but he could feel the tone, firm, confident, almost commanding. Curious and a little nervous, John stepped closer to the source. And then he saw them. Three enormous women stood in the yard, each easily twice the height of an ordinary person. Their presence was so striking that John froze in place. They looked strong and powerful, yet there was something calm and natural about the way they moved. Each woman had a different expression, one curious, one amused, and one watchful, but all three turned their gaze toward him immediately. John took a cautious step forward. "Hello," he said, his voice trembling slightly. I think I bought this farm. My name is John." He had expected challenges, perhaps repairs, maybe neighbors who were skeptical of a new farmer, but he had never imagined this. Three giants claiming his farm. It sounded impossible. I have the papers," John said, fumbling with the documents in his hands. "I signed with the real estate agent. Everything is legal. I didn't know anyone lived here already." The land seemed ordinary at first, but now he noticed subtle signs of care everywhere. The soil in the fields was tilled with precision. The barn had been maintained well, and paths crisscrossed the property as if carefully planned. He realized that despite its appearance, this farm had been alive and tended, not abandoned as he had thought. For a long moment, he didn't know what to say. I didn't mean to intrude," he finally said. I just saw the listing and I thought this could be my home. It has history, traditions, and boundaries that must be respected." The women moved with surprising grace, showing him small details around the farmhouse and barn. They pointed out areas where crops had been planted, where animals had lived, and where the land was considered sacred. Every step he took made him feel smaller, not because of their size alone, but because of their presence and the knowledge they carried. By the end of the day, John was exhausted, not physically but mentally. He had imagined a quiet life, working alone on his farm. Instead, he had met three extraordinary women, giants in every sense, who were both intimidating and fascinating. He realized that owning a farm was not just about money or documents. It was about respect, understanding, and coexistence. As the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of orange and gold, John sat on the porch of the farmhouse and reflected. He had come here with dreams of independence, but now he faced a new reality. This farm was not just land. It was a community, a history, and a living presence that demanded patience and humility. John made a silent promise to himself. He would learn from these women, earn their trust, and find a way to live in harmony. It would not be easy, but the reward was far greater than he had imagined. This farm, though challenging, could become the home he had always dreamed of, but only if he respected those who had been here long before him. As night fell, the valley was quiet except for the distant calls of birds and the soft rustle of leaves. John looked at the stars and smiled. This was the beginning of a story he had never planned, yet one he was determined to live. The cheapest farm in the valley had given him more than land. It had given him a lesson in humility, patience, and the unexpected ways life can surprise someone willing to take the first step. John woke up the next morning feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The night had been quiet, and he had thought a lot about what had happened the day before. Owning a farm had been his dream for so long, yet he now realized that this dream was far more complicated than he had imagined. The three women were not ordinary people. They were giants in size and presence, and their experience with the farm made him feel inexperienced and small. But he was determined to find a way to live there, to learn from them, and to make this farm his home without causing any trouble. After breakfast, which the women had quietly prepared in a kitchen that was far larger than it seemed from the outside, John decided to try to learn more about the land and the people who had lived there for so long. He asked questions politely, trying to show respect and genuine interest. The tallest woman, whose name was Mara, spoke first. She explained that the farm had been in her family for generations. Her ancestors had built it from scratch, cultivating the soil, planting trees, and caring for animals. Everything John saw, the fields, the barn, even the small stream that ran along the edge of the property, had been tended carefully over decades. John listened intently, feeling awe and respect grow in him. He realized that he had bought more than just a piece of land. He had bought a story, a legacy, and a way of life that he didn't fully understand yet. The second woman, Leora, showed him the boundaries of the farm. She pointed out which parts were used for crops, which areas were left wild for nature, and where the animals were kept. Every part of the land had a purpose, and every detail mattered. John could see that nothing here was accidental or neglected. At first, John felt overwhelmed. The land was larger than he had imagined, and managing it alone would be impossible. But the women made it clear that he could stay and help, as long as he respected the rules. "We will not stop you from learning," Mara said, "but this farm works only when everyone understands their place. You must be patient, careful, and willing to follow our guidance." Even their footsteps seemed deliberate and purposeful, as if they were in tune with the land itself. John realized he had much to learn, not just about farming, but about living in harmony with people who were stronger, wiser, and more experienced than him. By midday, John decided to try helping. He picked up a hoe and started working on a small patch of soil that Leora had marked for him. At first he struggled. The earth was tougher than he expected, and his movements were slow and awkward. Mara noticed and came over, demonstrating the proper way to hold the tool and how to dig efficiently. John followed her instructions carefully, slowly improving. Leora then taught him how to plant seeds evenly, making sure each one had space to grow. It was hard work, and John felt exhausted by the afternoon, but he also felt a sense of accomplishment that he had never experienced before. For the first time, he realized that farming was not just about owning land. It was about respect, effort, and patience. The women's guidance made him feel like part of something bigger than himself. As the day passed, the women shared stories about the farm and the valley. Mara spoke of her childhood, running across the fields with her sisters, learning to care for animals, and helping her parents plant crops. Leora described how she had learned to make tools and repair buildings, skills that had been passed down through generations. The third woman, Sira, told tales of the local wildlife and the natural cycles of the land, explaining how each season brought new challenges and opportunities. John listened, fascinated, realizing that every story contained lessons he could apply to his own work. Even as he learned, John also noticed the challenges of living on the farm. The women's size and strength meant that everyday tasks were easier for them but difficult for him. Carrying heavy sacks of grain, lifting tools, and moving large pieces of wood tested his endurance. He had to pace himself and take frequent breaks, which made him feel slow and clumsy. Yet the women were patient with him. "You will learn," Sira said kindly. "The land does not need to be conquered. It needs to be understood." He wanted to contribute to earn their trust and to show that he could be helpful rather than a burden. Over the next few days, John settled into a routine. Each morning, he woke early to help with chores, feeding animals, collecting eggs, and preparing soil for planting. The women guided him patiently, correcting mistakes and demonstrating techniques. John discovered that farming required more than physical strength. It required attention to detail, observation, and respect for the natural rhythms of the land. Every action had consequences. A seed planted too close to another would not grow well. Watering too much or too little could damage a crop. Every day was a lesson, and John soaked up every bit of knowledge he could. Despite the hard work, there were moments of laughter and lightness. The women had a sense of humor that caught John off guard. Mara teased him when he stumbled with a bucket of water. Leora laughed at his attempts to carry hay, and Sira told playful stories about animals getting into mischief. These moments helped John feel included, not just as a worker, but as someone they were willing to teach and accept. Slowly, the fear and intimidation he had felt at first began to fade. One afternoon, John noticed something unusual. The women paused their work and stood silently, looking toward the distant hills. Curious, he asked what was happening. Mara explained that the land was connected to the valley and the surrounding forests. Changes in weather, animal movements, and even the growth of plants were all signs that the land communicated with those who paid attention. She said that patience and observation were as important as strength and skill. John realized that he was learning not just about farming, but about understanding nature in a deeper way than he had ever imagined. Days turned into weeks, and John grew stronger, more confident, and more connected to the land. He began to anticipate the needs of the farm, helping without being asked. He learned to recognize animal behavior, identify which areas needed water, and even notice subtle signs of soil health. The women began to rely on him more, treating him as a partner rather than a student. He felt a sense of pride and belonging that he had never felt in the city, yet challenges remained. There were moments when John felt frustrated by his own limitations. Carrying heavy loads, performing tasks too slowly, or making mistakes reminded him that he was still learning. But the women's patience and guidance made these moments easier to bear. They never mocked him, and they celebrated his progress, no matter how small. John realized that respect, trust, and perseverance were more valuable than speed or strength. By the end of the month, John had transformed in ways he had not anticipated. The farm was no longer just a property he had bought. It was a living, breathing community that included him and the three women. He had learned the value of patience, the importance of observation, and the power of collaboration. Most importantly, he had learned to respect the women, not just for their size and strength, but for their wisdom, experience, and dedication to the land. As the sun set on another day, John stood in the middle of the fields looking out at the valley. The wind carried the scent of grass and soil, and the gentle calls of animals echoed in the distance. He felt a deep sense of gratitude. This farm, which had seemed like a simple dream, had turned into a journey of learning, respect, and growth. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but he also knew that he was not alone. The three women were there, guiding him, teaching him, and accepting him into a world he had only begun to understand. John smiled to himself. He had bought the cheapest farm in the valley, but he had gained something far more valuable: knowledge, friendship, and a place where he truly belonged. He felt ready to face whatever challenges came next, knowing that he was now part of a story much bigger than he had ever imagined. John had been living on the farm for several months now, and life had started to feel more normal. The daily routines, the hard work, and the guidance of the three women had become part of his life. Yet, he knew that living on this farm was never going to be completely easy. Despite the progress he had made, challenges continued to appear, some from the land itself, and some from the unusual dynamics of sharing it with three giant women. One early morning, as the mist hung low over the fields, John noticed that a section of the crops he had planted was not growing properly. The soil looked dry in some areas and too wet in others. He tried watering and adjusting the plants, but nothing seemed to work. Feeling frustrated, he walked toward Mara, hoping she could help. Mara knelt down beside the plants and examined them carefully. "You see, John," she said gently, "the land is alive in its own way. It reacts to seasons, weather, and even the energy of the people who work on it. Sometimes you need to step back and observe before acting. Too much interference can hurt the plants as much as too little." He spent hours watching the plants, noticing small patterns he had never seen before: the way the soil absorbed water, the direction the sun hit each row, and how certain leaves curled at different times of the day. Slowly, he learned to adjust his care. By the end of the week, the plants were recovering, and John felt a sense of accomplishment. He realized that farming was not just physical work. It was also about patience, observation, and understanding nature. While John learned these lessons from the land, he also faced challenges in his relationship with the women. Living so closely with three people who were so different from him required constant communication and respect. There were times when John felt clumsy, unsure of his place, or afraid of making mistakes. For example, one day he accidentally trampled a patch of wildflowers that Sira had planted to encourage bees and butterflies. The women did not scold him harshly, but their disappointment was clear. John apologized sincerely and helped restore the area, learning to be more careful and aware of his surroundings. Despite these small setbacks, John's bond with the women grew stronger. He began to understand their personalities more deeply. Mara was disciplined and focused, often thinking ahead and planning the farm's work carefully. Leora was practical and efficient, always ready to teach John new skills. Sira was gentle and nurturing, more concerned with the balance of nature and the well-being of the animals. Each of them taught John something different, and he realized that the farm was a place of continuous learning, not just work. One day, as John was carrying water to the crops, a sudden storm appeared over the valley. Dark clouds rolled in and the wind picked up with surprising force. Rain began to pour and John felt panic. He knew that if the storm continued, it could damage the crops and the barn. The three women appeared immediately, moving with speed and skill that amazed him. Mara directed him to secure the tools and equipment. Leora helped reinforce the barn doors, and Sira calmed the animals, ensuring that none were hurt. John tried to keep up, but he realized how much he still had to learn. Carrying heavy buckets of water against the wind, running to tie down loose boards, and keeping the animals safe exhausted him. Yet, the women never lost patience. They guided him, offered encouragement, and even reassured him when he felt scared. By the time the storm passed, the farm was mostly unharmed. John felt a mix of relief and admiration. He realized that life on this farm required not just hard work, but courage, quick thinking, and teamwork. After the storm, John decided he needed to improve his skills even more. He started waking up earlier to study the land, noting weather patterns, soil conditions, and animal behavior. He tried to anticipate problems before they happened and learned to ask the women for advice instead of acting blindly. Gradually, he became more confident, and his contributions to the farm began to feel meaningful. The women noticed his progress and started including him more in decision-making. Even with this progress, John still faced emotional struggles. Living with people so extraordinary sometimes made him feel small, and he often doubted his abilities. He worried that he was not strong enough, fast enough, or knowledgeable enough to keep up with the women. Some nights he sat alone on the porch, watching the stars, feeling both awe and fear at the world he had stepped into. But he also reminded himself of how far he had come, and that each day was an opportunity to learn something new. Over time, John discovered more of the women's stories, and this helped him understand their perspective. Mara spoke about her childhood, how she and her sisters had learned to care for the land, and the responsibilities they had inherited. Leora shared memories of difficult winters, when crops failed and animals were sick, teaching John that resilience was as important as skill. Sira described the importance of living in harmony with nature, showing him that every action had consequences beyond the immediate moment. These stories inspired John to keep trying, even when work was hard or progress was slow. John also began to see the humor in their daily life. Despite their size and power, the women had a playful side. Mara would sometimes lift him gently and move him from one task to another, teasing him about how small he was. Leora laughed when he dropped a basket of vegetables, and Sira told silly stories about animals getting into mischief. These moments lightened the intensity of farm life and reminded John that working hard did not mean he couldn't enjoy life. As the weeks passed, John faced more serious challenges. A herd of wild deer began entering the property and eating some of the crops. He tried to chase them away but quickly realized he was no match for the animals' speed and agility. Mara, Leora, and Sira guided him, showing him how to set barriers, make natural deterrents, and observe the animals' patterns. It was frustrating for John, but he learned to problem-solve instead of acting impulsively. By the end of the month, the deer no longer caused significant damage, and John felt proud of the solutions he had helped implement. Through all of this, John learned something unexpected. The farm was not just about work, it was about trust, respect, and patience. The women were not intimidating obstacles anymore. They were teachers, mentors, and friends. He had grown stronger, wiser, and more capable, but he also realized that strength alone was not enough. Understanding, observation, and cooperation were equally important. One evening, as the sun set over the valley, John sat with the three women on a hill overlooking the farm. They talked quietly, sharing thoughts and reflections. Mara praised him for his dedication and willingness to learn. Leora reminded him that mistakes were part of the process and that perseverance was the true measure of success. Sira spoke about the harmony they had achieved, noting that John's respect for the land and the farm's traditions had made him a part of their world. John felt a deep sense of belonging. He had started this journey alone, dreaming of a simple farm, but he had discovered something far richer. Life on the farm was challenging, unpredictable, and at times exhausting, but it was also rewarding, full of lessons, and filled with connection. He realized that the farm, the women, and the valley had become part of who he was. Yet John knew that more challenges lay ahead. Seasons would change, crops would fail, and unexpected events would test his skills and patience. But he also knew that he was no longer the same person who had arrived at the farm months ago. He had grown, learned, and become part of a community that was larger and more extraordinary than he could have imagined. As the stars began to twinkle above the valley, John smiled. He understood that living on this farm was not just about survival or ownership. It was about respect, learning, and embracing challenges with courage and patience. The journey was far from over, but he felt ready to face whatever came next, knowing that he had the guidance, wisdom, and companionship of the three women who had taught him so much. This chapter of his life, the challenges, the lessons, and the growth, had transformed him. He had started with fear and uncertainty, but he was now confident in his ability to contribute, adapt, and thrive. The farm was no longer just land for him. It was a living, breathing world that he was proud to be a part of. The months passed quickly, and John began to feel that the farm was no longer just a place to work. It was his home. The early fears and uncertainties that had clouded his mind when he first arrived were gradually replaced by confidence, respect, and a sense of belonging. The three women, Mara, Leora, and Sira, had become more than guides. They were companions, teachers, and friends who had shown him a world far beyond what he had imagined. John had grown physically stronger, more skilled, and more patient. He could carry heavy tools, tend to crops, and care for the animals with much less effort than when he had first arrived. But beyond the physical abilities, he had developed something more valuable: understanding. He had learned the rhythm of the land, the way the animals behaved, and how to predict changes in weather. He could read the signs in the soil, the wind, and the trees, and he had learned to act with care, rather than rushing or forcing results. Life on the farm was still hard work, but it was fulfilling. Every morning, John would wake before the sun to feed the animals and check the crops. He worked alongside Mara in the fields, learning the finer techniques of planting, watering, and harvesting. Leora taught him how to repair tools, maintain the barn, and organize resources efficiently. Sira guided him in understanding nature, the importance of leaving some areas wild for wildlife, creating natural habitats, and ensuring the farm was balanced. Together, they managed the land in a way that was sustainable and harmonious. One bright morning, John noticed that the animals seemed restless. The goats bleated loudly, the chickens scratched at the ground nervously, and even the horses were uneasy. John had learned to trust his instincts, so he asked Mara, Leora, and Sira to observe with him. They quickly realized that a storm was coming, stronger than any they had faced before. It was not just rain. They anticipated high winds and heavy flooding. John felt a twinge of fear. He had survived storms before, but the thought of losing crops, damaging buildings, or endangering the animals made him tense. The women moved with urgency but calm determination. Mara directed John to secure the crops, guiding him to build temporary protections over the most vulnerable plants. Leora checked the barn, reinforcing doors, tying down loose equipment, and ensuring the animals were safely enclosed. Sira calmed the animals, speaking softly to them and keeping them steady amidst the growing wind. John realized that the farm's survival depended on teamwork, trust, and quick thinking. The storm hit with full force by mid-afternoon. Rain poured in sheets, wind howled through the valley, and lightning flashed across the sky. John worked tirelessly, following the women's instructions, moving between tasks and keeping the animals safe. At one point, a strong gust of wind nearly knocked him off his feet. Mara caught him with ease, laughing lightly. "You are learning, but always respect the power of nature." John smiled despite the fear, appreciating her patience and reassurance. By the time the storm passed, the farm had suffered some minor damage, but the crops, buildings, and animals were safe. John felt exhausted but exhilarated. He had faced one of the farm's greatest challenges and survived, not alone, but as part of a team. For the first time, he truly understood what the women had meant when they spoke about patience, observation, and respect. The farm was not just land. It was a living system, and living in harmony with it required cooperation and understanding. After the storm, life slowly returned to normal, but the experience left a lasting impression on John. He had gained confidence in his abilities and realized that challenges, though difficult, were opportunities for growth. He also noticed that the women trusted him more. They began to include him in decisions about the farm's future, listening to his suggestions and respecting his observations. John felt proud not because he was commanding authority but because he had earned trust and shown responsibility. As the seasons changed, John's connection to the land deepened. Spring brought new life, flowers blossomed, animals gave birth, and crops began to grow. John felt a sense of joy and wonder every time he walked through the fields, watching tiny seedlings push through the soil or seeing the animals thrive. Mara taught him advanced planting techniques. Leora showed him how to preserve food for the coming months, and Sira guided him in creating natural spaces for wildlife. Every day was full of learning, work, and small victories. Summer brought heat and long days. The work was harder, but John had become more efficient. He could anticipate when the plants needed water, how to protect them from pests, and when to harvest them for maximum yield. The women often praised his efforts, and John felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He realized that the farm was no longer a challenge he feared, it was a life he had earned. Autumn arrived with golden leaves and cooler temperatures. The harvest was abundant, and John felt satisfaction in the results of his hard work. He had helped plant, water, nurture, and protect the crops, and now he saw the fruits of those efforts. Mara, Leora, and Sira celebrated the harvest with him, teaching him traditional methods of storing food and preserving it for the winter. John realized that this was more than farming. It was a way of life, built on respect, knowledge, and cooperation. Winter was the hardest season. Snow covered the fields and icy winds swept across the valley. Yet John had grown strong, skilled, and resilient. He worked with the women to keep the animals warm, repair buildings, and prepare for the coming spring. He even learned to enjoy the quiet beauty of winter, the stillness of the snow-covered valley, the warmth of the farmhouse, and the sense of peace that came from surviving another season together. Throughout the year, John's relationship with the three women deepened. They had started as guides and teachers, but over time they became friends and companions. They shared stories, laughter, and quiet moments. Mara would sometimes tease him gently, Leora would laugh at his mistakes, and Sira would tell him stories about the valley's history. John learned that life was not just about work, it was also about connection, kindness, and joy. By the time another spring arrived, John felt that he truly belonged on the farm. The land, the animals, and the women were all part of his life. He had come as a stranger, unsure and inexperienced, but he had grown into someone capable, thoughtful, and confident. The farm was no longer just property he had bought, it was a home, a community, and a place of learning and growth. John often reflected on how far he had come. He remembered the day he first arrived, scared and overwhelmed by the three giant women. Now he could laugh at his own fears. He realized that those fears had been a necessary part of the journey, pushing him to learn, adapt, and grow. He had discovered that life was full of unexpected lessons, and that the greatest growth often came from facing challenges with patience, humility, and determination. One quiet evening, as the sun set over the valley, John stood with Mara, Leora, and Sira on a small hill overlooking the farm. The wind carried the scent of earth and flowers, and the sky was painted with brilliant shades of orange and pink. They stood together in silence, appreciating the beauty of the land they had nurtured and protected. John spoke softly. "I never imagined that owning this farm would mean so much more than land. You have taught me about patience, respect, and working with the land. I am grateful for everything I have learned from you. You are no longer just a visitor, you are part of this farm." Now he had found not just a home, but a purpose, a community and a way of life that filled him with joy. He understood that the farm's value was not in its price, but in the experiences, lessons, and relationships it offered. As night fell, John looked up at the stars. The valley was quiet, peaceful, and full of life. He felt a deep sense of contentment. The cheapest farm in the valley had given him more than land. It had given him wisdom, friendship, and a place where he truly belonged. He knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but he also knew that he was ready to face them, surrounded by those who had guided him, taught him, and accepted him as one of their own. John smiled, feeling gratitude for the journey he had taken. The farm had tested him, taught him, and transformed him. It had given him the chance to grow in ways he could never have imagined, and he realized that the greatest value in life was not in possessions or wealth, but in learning, respect, and the bonds we build with others. The farm was no longer just a dream. It was a reality that he cherished, a life he had earned, and a story he would carry with him forever. And as he stood with Mara, Leora, and Sira, looking out over the valley, John knew that this was only the beginning of a life filled with growth, adventure, and harmony with the land he now called home.